People talk about betrayal like it's a surprise. Like one morning you wake up and the ground is simply gone beneath your feet, and there was no possible way to see it coming. That has not been my experience. In my experience, betrayal announces itself quietly weeks before it happens in the small things: a document with a name that shouldn't be there, a meeting that ends 10 minutes early, a man who stops looking you in the eye when he used to look at you in everything. Welcome back. If you're new here, stay close, because the people in these stories always think they got away with it. They never do. My name is Dominic Reeves, and there are a few things you should understand about me before this story makes complete sense. The suit is real. The watch is real. The silver in my hair, I stopped fighting that around 47, and honestly, I think it intimidated people more than the dark did, so I made my peace with it. What I'm telling you is that I don't hide what I am. I never developed the habit of making myself smaller so that other people feel more comfortable in the room. I am 6'2". I move deliberately, and there is a faint scar above my right eyebrow that I have never once explained to anyone who asked. Nobody asks twice. What I do keep quiet, and this is the part that matters, is what I know. I know considerably more than I show. I have known considerably more than I show for most of my professional life, and the gap between those two things is where I do my best work. For 11 years, I co-owned Meridian Capital Group with a man named Jamal Okafor. Private equity, asset management. We built it from a single rented office in Atlanta and a combined net worth that would not have impressed anyone. Jamal was the handshake, the room presence, the man who could walk into a cold meeting and have them warm before the first coffee was poured. I was the architect, the structure, the reason clients came back. Between us, we had built something real, the kind of firm that doesn't make headlines, but manages the kind of money that funds the people who do. I want to be honest with you about something. On the night this story begins, a Tuesday in November, 11:47 p.m., my phone face up on the desk with a banking alert that should not have existed. I was not surprised. I was not afraid. I was not even angry. Not in any way that anyone watching me would have recognized. I sat in that chair in the dark, and I read the alert twice. $2.4 million. International wire. Cayman Islands. A holding company I had never heard of, registered to no one I was supposed to know. I set the phone face down. I sat with it for 4 minutes, and then I picked it up. Not to call Jamal, to call my attorney. Here is what I need you to understand before the story goes any further. That alert was not the beginning of anything. The alert was the last page of a file I had been building for 8 months. By the time that money moved, I was not reacting. I was releasing something I had been holding onto since the previous March when I found a document with a name on it that had no business being there, and I made a decision that I was going to say nothing, watch everything, and build the kind of case that doesn't leave a gap wide enough for a man to breathe through. By sunrise, every account Jamal had ever touched was frozen by federal order. He just didn't know that yet. I don't own many things I don't need. That's the first thing. The suits are tailored because an ill-fitting suit on a man my size looks like a threat, and I prefer to choose when I'm threatening. The watch is good, but not loud, the kind of piece that a certain kind of person notices and nobody else does. I keep my hair combed back because it takes 30 seconds, and I don't revisit decisions I've already made. There is a scar above my right eyebrow, maybe an inch long, sitting just at the edge of the bone. It's barely visible unless the light catches it. Nobody asks about it. I don't explain it. These are not personal details I offer to everyone. I'm offering them to you now, because the kind of man I am is the only reason this story ends the way it does, and you need to understand the architecture before you understand the structure it was protecting. I am not a man who moves through the world with noise. I move with intention. Every word I choose because it's the right one. Every room I walk into, I have already considered before I enter it. This is not arrogance. Arrogance is loud. What I'm describing is something quieter and considerably more useful, the specific patience of a man who understood early that the most dangerous position is the one nobody sees coming. I have spent the better part of my professional life being underestimated by men who mistook my calm for comfort. I never corrected them. Correction was never necessary. What I want you to understand is that I did not become this way by accident. I became this way because the alternative, being reactive, being readable, being the kind of man whose face tells you what he's thinking before he's finished thinking it, costs more than it's worth. I learned that lesson once a long time ago, and I learned it in a way that left a mark. Not the scar. Something deeper than that. The kind of mark that doesn't show in photographs, but shows in every decision you make for the next 30 years. I built Meridian Capital Group on that foundation. I built everything on that foundation. And when the time came, when the file was thick and the evidence was clean and the man I'd trusted for 11 years had finally moved the money he thought I would never trace, I did not raise my voice. I did not send an angry message. I did not give him the satisfaction of knowing that I knew. I made a phone call at 11:48 p.m. on a Tuesday in November, and I went to bed. Jamal and I met at an industry conference in Charlotte in the spring of 2013. I was there because a client had asked me to represent his interests in a panel discussion on regional investment strategy. Jamal was there because Jamal was always somewhere that mattered, working the room with the kind of natural ease that you either have or you don't, and he had it completely. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and a smile that arrived in his eyes first, which is rarer than people think, and he said something sharp about the panel moderator that made me laugh. I don't laugh easily. I noted that. We had dinner that evening with for other people, and by the end of it, I had already begun to understand what Jamal was and what he wasn't. He was brilliant with people. He could read a room the way a musician reads a score, instinctively ahead of the beat. He could make a skeptical client feel heard and a hesitant investor feel bold and a cold contact feel like an old friend inside of 40 minutes. What he wasn't, and he knew this about himself, was a systems man. Numbers without narrative bored him. Structure without motion felt like confinement. He needed someone who could build the architecture that his energy could operate inside of. I needed someone whose energy could put faces on the architecture I built. Meridian Capital Group was incorporated 14 months later. One office, 2 desks, a combined vision that was considerably larger than our combined balance sheet at the time. We grew it methodically, not fast. I have never trusted fast, but solidly. Year over year, client by client, relationship by relationship. By year 5, we were managing a portfolio that put us in a tier most firms our size never reach. By year 8, we had institutional clients, a second office, and a reputation that preceded us into rooms before either of us arrived. I trusted Jamal the way you trust the foundation of a building. You don't check it every day. You don't press on it every morning to make sure it's still holding. You just know it's there because you were there when it was poured and you know what it was made of. That is the specific, particular trust that makes a partnership like ours possible. And it is also, I understand now, the specific, particular trust that a certain kind of person will eventually decide to test. Jamal tested it in the one way I had not prepared for. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in a way that left obvious marks. He tested it with patience, with increments, with the kind of small, careful movements that only become visible when you step back far enough to see the whole pattern. I did not step back in time to see it coming, but I stepped back in time to see it clearly, which turned out to be enough. It was a quarterly filing review, a Tuesday in March, 8 months before November, that ended everything. I was at my desk at 7 in the evening, the office empty, the way I prefer it for document work, going through a routine audit of our referral fee distributions from the previous quarter. This was not unusual. I reviewed these personally twice a year because our referral network was the kind of asset that required the same care as any other line of revenue, and I did not delegate care. 40 minutes in, I found a name. It was listed as the beneficiary of a referral fee, $62,000, that should have cleared through Meridian's primary operating account. The name was Vantage Bridge Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands. I had never heard of it. I had never approved it. It was not in any vendor agreement I had ever signed, and I have signed every vendor agreement this company has ever entered. I read the line twice. I read it a third time. Then I set the document flat on my desk, took my phone from my jacket pocket, and photographed the page. I placed the document back in the file, closed the file, returned it to its drawer, and sat for a long moment in the quiet of my empty office. I did not call Jamal. That is the most important sentence in this chapter, and I want you to sit with it for a second. I did not call Jamal. I did not send a message. I did not flag the discrepancy in our shared accounting system. I did not do any of the things a man does when he believes the problem in front of him is a clerical error. Because I did not believe it was a clerical error. I turned off my desk lamp, put on my jacket, and drove home. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had already decided 3 things. I would say nothing, I would find out everything, and I would not move until the file was complete. I had been in rooms with men who thought they were the smartest presence at the table my entire professional life. The ones who got away with things were never the boldest. They were the most patient. I intended to be more patient. I want to describe what the next 8 months felt like, because I think people imagine that kind of sustained silence, knowing what you suspect, saying nothing, continuing to sit across from a man at a conference table every Tuesday, and discuss quarterly projections and client retention strategy. They imagine it must feel like pressure, like something building behind glass, looking for a crack. It didn't feel like that for me. It felt like work. The forensic accountant I brought in was named Patricia Wolay. She came recommended through my attorney, and she operated under a separate retainer, kept completely off Meridian's books, invoiced through a holding entity I had maintained since the early days for exactly this category of situation, the category I hoped would never arise. Patricia was methodical and entirely without drama, which is the only kind of person I can work with. She reviewed everything I sent her with the particular care of someone who understands that what she is building will eventually have to stand in front of a federal judge. What emerged over the following months was not a single act of theft. It was a system, 3 shell entities, each with different registered agents in different offshore jurisdictions, each receiving fees routed from Meridian through a mechanism that had been constructed over at least 2 years. Client relationships, 4 of them, had been quietly migrated toward subaccounts that only Jamal controlled, with referral structures that directed income away from the firm and into the shell network. The individual amounts were calibrated carefully, small enough in isolation to read as administrative rounding, large enough in aggregate to matter significantly. By October, the aggregate was approaching $900,000, not including whatever he was planning next. Patricia delivered the complete file to my attorney on the 3rd Friday of October. My attorney spent 10 days reviewing it, brought in a federal compliance specialist, and came back to me with one assessment. The evidence was clean, the chain of documentation was unbroken, and the filing was ready to be sealed with the court pending a triggering event. We agreed on the triggering event, a transfer above a threshold we specified, moving to any of the 3 identified shell entities or any new offshore account associated with the same network. The filing sat with the court, sealed, waiting. I went to work every Tuesday. I sat across from Jamal. I discussed quarterly projections and client retention strategy. Patience isn't a weakness. It is simply the discipline to wait until the file is thick enough that there is no longer any way out of it. At 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in November, my phone buzzed on my desk. I was not asleep. I am rarely asleep at 11:47 p.m. I was reading a brief on a prospective client, nothing urgent, and the buzz was the kind I had set specifically for banking alerts above a threshold I had defined 8 months ago in conversation with my attorney. I had set it and not thought about it again, the way you set a smoke alarm and go on living your life, because the point of a smoke alarm is not to think about it. The alert said, outbound wire transfer $2,400,000. International routing. Destination account, Cayman Islands. Beneficiary, Vantage Bridge Holdings. I read it once. Then I read it again. I set the phone face down on the desk. I want to tell you what those 4 minutes felt like, because they were the longest 4 minutes I have spent in recent memory, and also, in a strange way, the quietest. There was no rage. I want to be specific about that, because I think it matters. There was no spike of heat, no clenching jaw, no flash of the kind of fury that a betrayal of this size might reasonably produce in a man. What I felt was something considerably colder and considerably more settled than rage. What I felt was confirmation. The thing you have been quietly, patiently, carefully preparing for has arrived. That is what confirmation feels like. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like a door closing on a very long hallway. After 4 minutes, I picked up the phone. I called my attorney. I said 4 words. Asterisk, it just moved. Go. Asterisk, he said he'd make the call to the court contact immediately and would confirm when the sealed filing was activated. I said thank you. I hung up. Then I finished the brief I had been reading, turned off the lamp, brushed my teeth, and got into bed. I slept without difficulty. I want you to know that. Not because I am without feeling, but because the time for feeling was not that night. That night, everything was already in motion, and there was nothing left for me to do. The work had been done. The file was complete. The system was operating exactly as it had been built to operate. I closed my eyes. At 4 a.m., Judge Harold Kensington began reviewing the sealed filing in his home office in Atlanta. I know this because my attorney was on a call with the court liaison at 4:17 a.m. and sent me a message I did not see until morning. Judge Kensington was known in federal legal circles for 2 qualities that made him precisely the right man for a filing like ours: an absolute intolerance for procedural shortcuts and a willingness to move with speed when the evidence demanded it. Our evidence demanded it. Patricia's documentation was organized with the precision of someone who had testified before federal courts before and understood exactly what a judge needs to see and in what order. At 5:14 a.m., Judge Harold Kensington signed the emergency asset freeze order. The order covered every account held in the name of Jamal Okafor individually. It covered the 3 shell entities Patricia's team had identified and documented. It covered Vantage Bridge Holdings and 2 subsidiary accounts that our filing had traced through the offshore network. It covered every dollar that had moved through those structures in the previous 26 months, pending a full forensic accounting by court-appointed examiners. Total frozen assets: approximately $3.1 million, including the $2.4 million that had moved the previous night and had not yet fully cleared the international transfer process. I woke up at 6. I read my attorney's messages in sequence from oldest to newest, the way I read everything. I went downstairs, filled the kettle, and made myself a cup of coffee. I stood at my kitchen window and watched the light come in, the particular gray gold of early November in Atlanta, slow and reluctant, like it was deciding whether to bother. I did not call anyone. I did not send a message to Jamal. I did not post anything, say anything, or do anything that a reasonable observer would have identified as celebrating. There was nothing to celebrate. A man I had built something with for 11 years had tried to take from me, and I had prevented it, and now the legal system was going to do what the legal system does. That is not a celebration. That is a conclusion. I finished my coffee. I went upstairs. I put on a suit. I went to work. I have thought about Jamal's morning many times since then. Not obsessively, not with any particular emotion, but the way you think about a sequence of events you did not witness and can only reconstruct from the outside, filling in the shapes with what you know about a person. I imagine he woke at his usual time. He was always an early riser, 6:15, the kind of man who believed in momentum and understood that days with strong beginnings run differently than days that start slow. I imagine he made coffee. I imagine he checked his phone with the casual confidence of a man who went to bed the previous night, believing he was nearly out. The money had moved. The account was received. By morning it would be settled. And in a few weeks, when he had covered his traces properly, he would begin the process of extracting himself from Meridian on terms he had already been quietly engineering. I imagine the first notification stopped a mid-sip. Restricted access. Please contact your financial institution. I imagine he called the bank. I imagine the conversation was brief and unrevealing in the way those conversations always are, scripted, careful, referencing only a hold and a case number and a number to contact that turned out to be a federal compliance office. I imagine he called that number and was told something he was not prepared to hear. Then I imagine he called me. I watched his name appear on my phone screen and I let it ring. I let the second call ring. I let the third call go to voicemail, where he left a message I did not listen to until 2 days later. Not because I was punishing him, because there was nothing he could say to me that morning that needed to be heard that morning. We were past the part of this where conversation was useful. I don't feel victorious when I think about his morning. I want to be honest about that. I feel the way you feel when you finish something you never wanted to have to build, something difficult and necessary that required you to be a version of yourself you would rather not have needed. Not proud, exactly. Not relieved, exactly. Something quieter than both of those. Something that sits closer to done. 3 weeks after the freeze order, I was in the corridor outside a federal courtroom on the 4th floor of the Richard B. Russell Federal Building. I was there for a scheduling conference. Jamal was there with his attorney for the same conference. We had not spoken since before the transfer. I saw him from the end of the corridor. He had lost some weight. He was dressed well. Jamal always dressed well. That had never been about money, but there was something in the way he was standing that I had never seen before. A particular quality of stillness that didn't look like composure. It looked like a man holding himself together by deciding to stand very still. His attorney stepped away to speak with someone. Jamal looked up. He saw me. We covered the distance between us in a few steps and stopped about 4 feet apart, the way men do when they are not sure whether to extend a hand and have both separately decided not to. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "You could have just come to me." I considered that sentence. I considered it the way I consider most things, not quickly, not carelessly, but with the full weight of what it actually meant. He was not asking why I hadn't warned him. He was telling me that he believed, even now, that a conversation would have changed something. If I had walked into his office in March and placed the quarterly filing on his desk and asked him to explain Vantage Bridge Holdings, the outcome would have been different. Maybe he believed that. I don't know. I said, "I know." That was all. 40 seconds, total. We walked in opposite directions, back toward our respective attorneys, back into the machinery of a process that was going to take several more months to complete. I did not look back down the corridor. I did not need to. That was the last conversation Jamal Okafor and I ever had. The legal process concluded in the spring of the following year. The forensic accounting confirmed $2.9 million in diverted assets across the full period of the scheme, including fees, referral income, and the final transfer. A settlement was reached that recovered the majority of the diverted funds. Jamal Okafor surrendered his partnership stake, his equity position, and his right to any future claim against Meridian Capital Group or its assets. Additional federal proceedings were handled separately and are not mine to narrate. Meridian Capital Group was restructured under my sole ownership in April. The institutional relationships held, all of them, without exception, because those relationships had always been built on the architecture I provided, not the face Jamal presented. The client stayed. 2 new clients came aboard in the 6 months following the restructuring, referred to by people who had been watching the situation with the quiet attentiveness that the financial world brings to moments of institutional stress. They wanted to know how a firm handles pressure. Now they know. Enough for me. The name on the wall in our main conference room, the one that used to read Meridian Capital Group, Okafor and Reeves, was replaced in late April. It reads Meridian Capital Group, Reeves now. Clean. One name. The contractor who did the work asked if I wanted to take a photo with the new sign, the way people sometimes do. I told him no. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and started the day. I have been asked since then whether I feel any grief about what happened with Jamal. Not about what he did, about what we had before. 11 years is a long time. What we built together was real, and it worked, and there were years in the middle of it that I would not trade. I think about that sometimes. I don't think about it with bitterness. I think about it the way you think about a room you used to live in that no longer exists, clearly, without particular pain, with the understanding that the shape of your life continues to be made up of things that were and things that are. What I feel when I sit at my desk in that office now is not triumph. It is not a relief. It is the specific, quiet solidity of a man who found a hollow place in something he built and filled it properly. Concrete poured into the wall. Structure restored. The building stands. Some men build to prove something. I built it to protect something. The difference is what you're willing to do when someone tries to take it.